Hello guys, I'm James for Kit Guru. Welcome back to our Intel NUC 9 Extreme water cooling project. If you've been following the project so far, you know that in the first few episodes we've been concentrating on actually water cooling the NUC 9 Extreme element card. We've also got some case mods planned, so that is what we'll be concentrating on today. I'm going to show you in this episode how we went from this to this, but before we dive into these case mods and show you how they're done, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button and hit the bell button for notifications if you've been enjoying the project so far. If you want to help support Kit Guru, you can head over to our store and pick up some of the merch. You can also subscribe to our Patreon, and as always, if you want to catch up on some hardware reviews and catch up on some tech news and some gaming news, head over to kitguru.net, and you can also keep in touch with us on social media through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Discord. So let's crack on and have a look at how it's done. Before we actually move on to prepping and painting any panels, I just want to show you what I've done to this top panel. I've just modded it a little bit more. I've removed the rear spoiler thing, or the rear handle, from the back of the top panel. I've also drilled 4 holes in it, widened out these areas, or these cutouts here. 92mm fans are still installed. And you can also see on the chassis frame, just made 2 cutouts there. So the reason I've done that is so that I can fit this 240mm rad in place of where the 2x92mm rad went before. And when you look at it in position, it's a really good fit. It's actually almost the same width as the top panel. And there's a couple of reasons why I want to do this. Obviously, one is we'll get more surface area, which should improve the cooling. The other reason as well is the 240mm rad. It has these extra outlets, so you've got inlets or outlets on both sides of the radiator, and also one on the back there as well. Now the 2x92mm rad doesn't have these extra ports. When I was trying to fill and bleed the system with that 2x92mm rad fitted, it was really tricky. There was air getting trapped in the radiator. I tried all sorts of different ways to get it out. I got most of it out, but I think there was still some air trapped up there, which, if you've got air trapped in the radiator, it's obviously going to affect the efficiency of the radiator and affect the thermal performance. So hopefully, with this 240mm rad fitted, I should be able to loosen these off and let the air bleed out. Hopefully that should make it a bit easier filling and bleeding the system. And like I've said, there's more surface area with this 240mm rad, therefore it should improve the cooling. I have had to keep the 2 92mm fans. There's just not enough space to get 2 120s inside the case, so hopefully that should be enough airflow and it should improve cooling, as well as I think that looks better as well. I like the size and the proportions of this radiator. It seems to fit in better with this case, especially when the width of it is virtually identical to the width of the case. So that's what I've been doing with that. I also have this panel that has an Intel 6 pillars logo cut out of it. I plan to maybe put some blue acrylic at the back of that and then use that on one of the side panels, potentially cut out this area and bond that inside the back of that panel. Not sure 100% how that's going to work yet, but that will be something else I'll need to do before prepping and painting the case. So if you have thought about giving your PC case a custom spray job before, there will be a few things you need to do that. Firstly, you'll need some kind of abrasives. With this NC100, this is a brand new case, so what I'll be using is just these pads. These are quite a fine abrasive surface to them, and they've got like a foam at the other side. And what this will do is rough up the surface of these panels. These are obviously already painted, so it'll just rough that up to give it a good key for the paint or the primer to adhere to. Obviously, if you're using an older case that is a bit beat up, you might have to use some more aggressive abrasives, so you might need to get some wet and dry sandpaper. I usually start off from around 120 grit and then move up probably to 1000 grit, but that all depends on how smooth the surface is or how smooth a finish you need, and it depends on how rough or how beat up the original surface is to begin with. But for this, all we need is these sanding pads, and these will just give it a key for the paint to stick to. Obviously you'll need some masking tape if you want to mask up some areas that you don't want to get painted. There might be 1 or 2 areas on this. I'm also going to be colour coding this radiator, so I'll need to mask up the actual fins. Don't want to paint those because it could affect the performance of the radiator. Also I have to mask up these outlets a little, but I'll basically be painting the frame and the end tanks on this. And when that is finished, I'm going to try and get some kind of acrylic panel with maybe like a hexagonal mesh cut out of it, just to kind of finish off that radiator, because it might look a little bit ugly with the fins showing afterwards. I'm not sure yet, but that's another plan. So you need some masking tape. Before you actually put on the top coat or the finish coat, you'll need to coat the panels with a primer. So I'm just using this white primer for this case. Obviously the top coat is going to be white, so a white primer underneath will be needed. If you're using different colours, sometimes you have to use a grey, or if you have a really rough surface and you want to fill it in, you can get a filler primer, which helps just make the final appearance look a bit smoother. But we'll be using a white primer. And then for the top coat, I'm going to be using this Plasticoat white satin. That should more or less give it a similar finish to the stock black paint. I think that is a satin finish, so I've got a few cans of that as well. I'm also possibly adding some blue highlights. Maybe the mesh that is behind this grill on this side panel, I might try and remove that and paint that blue to fit in with the blue and white Intel theme. You may also need some thinners. This is really handy for cleaning up afterwards. When you've used the spray paint, you can take the nozzle off the spray can, soak that in thinners, and if you've only used some of this, then that'll clean the nozzle and you'll be able to use it again. You also need to make sure you keep your lungs protected, so I'm going to be using one of these respirator masks while I'm using the spray paint. It's also a really good idea to make sure you open some doors or windows if you're doing it inside, just to keep the room ventilated. Make sure you're not inhaling too many toxic fumes. So we'll start with an easy bit to begin with. So this is just one of the side panels off the case. First thing I'm going to do is try and remove these screws. Just press on the back of the screw and just unscrew it and it will come out. That's those removed. I also want to remove this mesh because potentially I might paint this a different colour. This is just stuck on with some kind of double-sided tape. So just stick a knife under there and try and lift that off. Looks like it's coming off pretty easily. So that's come off pretty easily and it's not made too much mess on here. There is a bit of this double-sided tape left. And that just comes off pretty easily. So just to get rid of any potential residue that's been left behind by that tape, I'm just going to use a bit of a rag and the thinners. That just gets rid of any potential adhesive that's left over, because any adhesive or any contaminant that's left over, it may affect how the primer and how the paint adheres to the surface. So you want to make sure that you get any contaminants off the surface before you start painting. You can see that that's removed any of the adhesive or any residue that was left over. So now that we've got any bits removed from the panel that we don't want to paint while it's all attached, take one of these abrasive pads and just start roughing up the surface. Since this is technically a new panel that's freshly painted, you don't have to do a lot of work to it. It just needs the top of the surface just roughing up just enough so that it gives it a little key for the primer to adhere to. So we'll just do that. Probably spend 5 minutes just rubbing this down, and then once that's done, this panel will be ready for the primer. I'm going to be painting both sides of the side panels, so I need to obviously just smooth them down or rough them up on both sides. You can see that on this side now we've kind of lost that satin sheen finish to it, and that's kind of what you want to be aiming for, is just to rough it up enough so it takes any shine off the surface. And you can just see that it's a bit rougher than it was before. Any dust that's left behind, we'll clean that off first with some thinners or some isopropyl alcohol. And you do need to ensure that the surface is absolutely free from dust, free from any oils or contaminants or anything like that that is going to potentially affect how well the primer and how well the top coat adheres to the surface. Virtually the same procedure with this radiator. Again, we just need to rough up the surface. Same thing again, using this abrasive pad. This is a bit trickier than the side panel. There's more kind of nooks and crannies you need to get into, but just make sure you get everything. One of the main things really is the preparation when you're painting anything. The better the preparation is, usually the better the end product is. So just make sure you spend time on this and don't try and get through this part too quickly, because obviously the better job you do now, the better job the final finish will be. That's the 3 case side panels and the radiator all prepped up ready for painting. I've given them a quick blow down to blow the dust off and then just clean them up using the thinners and the rag. I've also cut the centre of this panel out, that piece, cut that out ready for the Intel logo panel. The plastic front panel will be painted as well, but that process is a little bit different. It's a bit more involved. There's a few bits to take off and other little jobs that need doing on that first. I'll show you how to do that later on. But now, I guess the next step really is to show you how we apply the primer and apply the paint. So I've just masked off an area with some cardboard to stop it getting completely ruined by any overspray. First we'll be using the white primer. The first thing you need to do is give it a good shake. Probably spend about 5 minutes shaking the can. Make sure that everything is mixed up correctly. Another good tip as well, if it's a bit cold where you're spraying, the paint might be a bit thick, so you could put the can on top of a radiator or just move it inside just to warm it up. It just stops the nozzle blocking up. I've also had to open a couple of doors just to help with ventilation in here, so I apologise if you hear any background noise. So once you've got your can of primer shook up and everything inside is all nicely mixed up, we just start off painting one of the panels, just using a side to side motion, and keep the can about 200 to 300 mil away from what you're painting, and just make sure you get all of it. Make sure it's nice and even. But to begin with, we just put on a really thin coat on each one of the panels. Try not to put on too much to begin with, especially the primer. It needs to be a light mist coat to begin with. Move your parts round so that you get all the edges. Just be careful not to touch any of the bits you've just painted, or you'll end up with a fingerprint in the paint. So once you've done that first coat, you want to leave it about 15-20 minutes just for that first coat to harden enough to apply a second coat. And I'd suggest with the primer, probably get 2 coats, 3 coats maximum. And just remember to build the coats up in thin layers rather than applying a really thick layer. You'll get a better finish, and also the paint will stick better doing it in thin layers. Obviously, if you're painting both sides of the panels, you want to prime both sides with a couple of coats of primer. Once you have applied a couple of coats and you're happy that they're evenly covered, you want to leave the panels for 24 hours just for the primer to fully cure, and then you can move on to the top coat. So while I'm waiting for the primer to dry on those other parts, I'm gonna have a bit of time to kill, so I may as well get on with prepping up the radiator ready for painting, because this will need to be primed up and painted in the same way as the other panels. As I mentioned earlier, there's parts of the radiator that I want to paint and there's other parts that I don't want to paint because it could affect the thermal performance. So because I don't want to paint it all, I'm going to have to mask up the areas that I don't want to paint. So do that with some masking tape, and you also need a sharp knife, so I'll put a new blade in that Stanley knife. Craft knife would work well as well. So basically all I need to do is find the end of the tape, which is never a simple task. Start in the centre of the actual radiator itself. The other thing that I want to mask up as well is these holes. I don't want too much paint getting inside there. Potentially it could flake off and block up the radiator, so roll up a bit of tape. Just stick it inside each one of those. Same on this side. Just roll it up and then stick it inside. So that means that you'll be able to paint round the hole, but not too much should get inside. And then one also in the end of this one. Hopefully we'll just be able to pick those out with a sharp point or a flat screwdriver or something like that. So now that is the radiator masked up, and now we'll just prime that up in the same way as the other panels. Leave this overnight, 24 hours, come back to them tomorrow. So as well as painting the steel side panels and the radiator, I also want to paint the front panel. Now the front panel is made out of plastic, so the process it's similar, but it's slightly different. We just need to use a different primer. This is a plastic primer, so we'll obviously have to use the plastic primer to add the base coat. The other thing as well is I want to remove these buttons, so I need to figure out a way of doing that. If I leave the buttons in place, I potentially have to mask up, especially around this power button, the bit where the light comes through, so that might be tricky. So instead I'm going to try and remove them. Now you can see the back of this panel, the buttons are kind of riveted with maybe a plastic rivet. They're just kind of some plastic bits that stick up, and then it looks like the tops of them are just melted over to stop the button falling off. So I think the first method may be to try and melt the plastic and see if I can just lift them off. Maybe give that a go first. So for my first attempt, I'm going to try and just melt the little plastic rivets or whatever they are using a soldering iron. This is a 25 watt soldering iron. I think this is the most powerful one I've got. So see if this works. Try and soften up the plastic. It's actually come away from one side, so I'm just holding it there while it cools down. Let's try it on the other side. It might have actually worked that. It has still left those two plastic pegs there, so that might be alright. We'll try again with the reset button down at the bottom, see if that works the same. I'm just going to try and get underneath it first. A bit of pressure might work. Yeah, that seems to have worked better actually. So getting a bit of pressure underneath it first might have been the key. Try again on this side. So yeah, that seems to have come off a bit easier as well. So, and again you can see that those two plastic pegs are still there, so hopefully should be able to slot those back on and just melt the plastic together again, and hopefully that should work. And then you can see this power button, it's made up of two pieces, so you've got this kind of white or opaque outer rim, and then the inside is black like the front panel. So I can see that that just clips in, so just lift that bit out and I'll be able to paint that part the same colour as the front panel, and hopefully when it's all painted should just be able to reassemble it, and fingers crossed it'll all work as it should do. Next we need to prep these plastic parts, and that's done in the same way as the steel parts. So just use these abrasive pads just to rough the surface up and give it a key for the primer to stick to. The only other difference, like I mentioned, is you need to use a plastic primer on these plastic parts because it's more flexible, so it allows the paint to flex a little and it should stop it from cracking. I don't think I'm going to bother painting the back of this because obviously once it's clipped onto the case you're not going to see it. So just as we did with the metal parts, just give this a light rubbing down or roughing up with these abrasive pads. Same for the center of the power button, and also do the same on the reset button because they're both getting painted. Radiator's ready, and the front panel is now ready to go into the painting area and to give it some coats of primer. It just needs cleaning up in the same way as I did with the steel parts. So that's basically everything prepared, ready for priming. So I'll move these over to the spraying area, prime these up, leave them again for 24 hours. We'll come back to these tomorrow and apply the top coat. The primer's hardened enough to apply the top coat to these parts now, and I've got a quick tip for these smaller parts. These can be difficult to hold on to, or if you just put them down to paint them, sometimes they can stick to the covering. So what I do is just get a little bit of blue tack, just roll that up in a ball, stick that to the bottom of the part, and then just get a nail and push that into the head of the nail, and then you can just stick it in your cardboard, and if you need to take it out to rotate it, you can just pop it out and then stick it back in again. That just stops it sticking to the cardboard and stops it getting in a mess. And again, we use the same method as we did with the primer with the top coat. So you want to hold the can about 200 to 300 mil away from the actual item you're painting, and just pop my mask on. And then as we did before, it's side to side action, trying to keep it as even as possible, and just building up thin coats. And as we did with the primer, we want at least 2 or 3 coats to get a nice even finish. So that is the first coat applied to this side of the parts. I need to now leave them again for another 15 or 20 minutes before I do another coat. And then once this side's had a couple of coats, I'll flip them over, coat the other side a couple of times, and then again it's a case of leaving them for 24 hours to allow the paint to harden, and then they should be ready to fit back to the case. Okay, just a quick recap then. All of the steel side panels have had 3 coats with this white satin paint, so as the radiator, except for the center, and so as the plastic front panel. And you can see it's got a very slight creamy tinge to it, but I actually like that. It kind of reminds me of an old car that I had when I first passed my driving test, so I quite like the look of that. And it probably won't show up fingerprints as well, especially with it being a satin finish rather than a glossy finish. The power button that goes on the front panel, I've actually painted that blue, as well as this mesh goes behind this panel, so that's blue as well. And we also have this brushed aluminium panel. This is the Intel 6 Pillars logo, and that's going to fit on the back of there, and it's also backed with this blue acrylic sheet. It's been about 18 hours since I did the last coat of paint on all these parts, so it's probably not fully hardened yet, but it's tough enough to carry on working with. So what I need to do now really is reassemble everything, reinstall these panels and this mesh. I'll show you how to do that. Fit this button and this reset button back to the front panel, and then fit everything back to the chassis, which is still black. I've kept this black because everything inside is black as well, so the power supply, this pump, even the PCBs on everything are black, so I've kept the internals black for a bit of a contrast. So now, yep, fit all these panels back to the case, reassemble everything, see what it looks like. The first thing is to put this mesh back on, now that it's repainted. I'm going to be using this double-sided tape. This is 5mm wide It's extremely thin, but it's also very sticky. It's the kind of stuff that's used for repairing small electrical devices, for like reassembling phones and stuff like that. So, and it's virtually the same stuff that was used on this mesh originally. I'll stick that to the mesh first and then stick that onto the panel. So it's pretty simple. You just need a Stanley knife blade or craft knife, and just need to peel some of this off. Start on one side and just stick it right on the edge, and then when it's at the right length, just cut through it with the knife. As I said, this is exactly how it was fitted originally, so it's like it's almost like a factory finish. And once you've got all 4 pieces on, you need to try and peel off this backing. It's probably the most difficult part about this, peeling this off. Just get the blade underneath it, you can just get it off. So now that tape's got the backing peeled off, just try and keep it pretty central. That looks pretty good. Stuck on there really well. There you can see, I mean, it's not a major difference, but you can just see the blue shining through, and this panel will be going on the right hand side of the case, so I needed to keep this as a mesh panel because the power supply will be pulling in air from outside through that, but quite like that blue and white theme. So next I'm going to fit this brushed aluminium 6 pillars panel into this side panel that I cut out earlier. Just going to use the same method because this tape is really sticky. It's a really strong bond when you get it all attached with this tape, so I've not got any worries that it's going to fall out or anything like that. So just use the same method, but I'll stick the tape to the metal side panel this time. I want to get it as close to the edge as possible, but the great thing about this tape is that it's so thin it doesn't leave a gap between the panels really when you stick them together. Central to the cutout as possible. What I might have to do is pull it towards the edge of the bench and lay it on top. That looks pretty good. Give it a good press down. Make sure it's stuck well. There we go, there's the brushed aluminium Intel 6 pillars logo on the side panel. That's going to be on the left hand side of the case, but we are going to add some lighting to the case, some custom lighting. Again, it's going to be a blue lighting to match the Intel theme. So what I might do is I might run some underglow lights on the bottom of the chassis here, so you get a nice glow from the bottom of the system when it's turned on. So that's both the side panels ready, prepped to be fitted back to the chassis. Next we need to install the radiator and the fans back to this top panel. Fans actually go on first because you can't access the fan screws once the radiator's screwed on top, so we need to get these on first and get them the correct way around. So that's the fans refitted. Now I just need to turn this upside down, line it up with the holes that I drilled. See the 4 holes line up, and also the cutouts line up with these ports for the fittings. So there you go, that's fans and radiator fitted to the top panel. It really lines up almost perfectly with the top panel, that radiator, and it's all looking pretty good now that it's all color coded. So that's ready. The front panel just needs the 2 buttons putting back on, so the power button and the reset button, and they were originally attached to these little pegs on the front panel. They were just plastic welded or melted in position, so I'm going to try and reproduce that. First I'm just going to poke these holes out with this probably pokey tool, just to clear out any debris in the holes, and then hopefully I'll just be able to pop them back over the pegs. That one fits on well. Same with the power button. That sits in position pretty well. I'm just going to use this soldering iron again. This is my 25 watt soldering iron. Just try and melt those back down like they were. That seems pretty good. It's probably not as neat as it was from the factory, but it seems to have worked. So I'll do the same with this reset button. That seems pretty good as well. It looks like they're firmly attached on there. Reset button's back in place. I've kept that white because it probably looks better staying white, but the power button is now blue and it has an outer ring that should light up, although I've not seen that lit up yet, but I'll definitely try and get that wired up for the final build. So let's pop all these panels back on the case and see what they look like. So I'll pop the front panel on, clips on, looks pretty good. Top panel next. Should just slot in position as it did. And then the new mesh panel with the blue and white theme that goes on this side to allow the power supply to breathe a little. That slides in nicely. And then finally, the 6 pillars Intel logo panel. See if this still fits. Yep, that slots in there nicely as well. So there it is, the finished article. I'm quite happy with how that looks. See it from all angles. Yeah, it's turned out looking rather nice. That I do have an acrylic white panel come in with like a hexagonal mesh cutout to go on the top of this radiator. I've kind of torn between using that or using some of that blue mesh and fitting that on there, but I think I'll probably go with that acrylic white panel when it arrives. It's not arrived yet, so you'll get a chance to have a look at that in the next video. The next video should be the final video. We're hoping to have the system completely built up in the next video, finished working. I've also had some other good news today as well. We have the 3D printed prototypes of our upper mounting brackets for the Alpha Cool water block. So they basically just slip on top of there like the original metal brackets do, and then they can just be bolted through using those mounting holes. These are the brackets that Luke designed. He drew these up on CAD, and we just had some prototypes printed in this plastic for now, just to see if they fit and see if we had to make any alterations to the design, but because Luke's such a good draftsman, they fit perfectly. So really happy with how they're looking. The good thing about these as well is the plastic that these are printed with, when you put 2 of them together, it's really rigid. So even if for any reason the metal ones didn't fit correctly or we didn't get the metal ones, I'm pretty sure you could use those 3D printed brackets and they would be sufficient. We've also had a very slight change in the design of this. Originally we'd planned to draw up quite a big and elaborate copper heat spreader that was very similar to the stock cooler. Kind of was going to mount the heat spreader down and then screw this to the top of that. That design's changed a little. I remember I had some of this solid copper bar and I've just cut a piece that is more or less the same dimensions as the actual CPU. I've lapped it on both sides so it's nice and flat on both sides. So basically the plan now is to use that as a heat spreader, put a bit of thermal compound in there and then bond that to the CPU like on a desktop CPU, and then basically now we have the bracket for this water block. We'll just be able to sit that on top and then bolt that straight down to the original back plate. So that's the plan. There's a little bit more work to be done in the next episode. We need to remove the back plate, just drill these holes out a little bigger so we can use the stock Alpha Cool mounting screws. We'll concentrate on that, getting the final system built up. Maybe some minor wiring mods will be needed as well for the fans and to run the pump. So that's what you've got to look forward to in the next video, which should be the final video in this series. And if you have been enjoying the series so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button and hit the bell button for notifications. And if you want to help support Kit Guru in other ways, you can head over to our store, pick up some of the merch, or you can subscribe to our Patreon to be the first to see new videos and new content. And as always, you can head over to the kitguru.net website where you can catch up on all the latest hardware reviews, catch up on some tech news and gaming news, and you can also follow us on our social media channels such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Discord. I've been James for Kit Guru. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.